XBRL requirements. Before we get started, I just have a couple of logistical points to cover. If you have any problems with audio or video during the session, please email us at support@xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back online. As we go through the program, feel free to submit questions to us by clicking on the Q&A link that you see on your screen console. That will submit questions to us and we can take them throughout the session. We are offering CPE credit for today's program, and we'll be stopping to take CPE questions at 2 points during the session. If you are getting CPE credit, please make sure that you respond to those questions, and we'll get you your certificate shortly after the program completes. If you did not sign on for CPE, you can still get it. Just answer the questions and we'll make sure that we get that to you, and we'll deal with the administrative side of that a little bit later. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about what we're going to be covering today. We're going to talk first about some basics of XBRL, talking about XBRL fundamentals. We'll then go into some CPE questions and then dive into the heart of the matter, which is really, XBRL for FERC filers as you prepare Form 6 and 6Q. We'll then follow up with some final CPE questions and then talk about some other programs and events that might be of interest. I do want to mention that our key speaker today is Campbell Pride. Campbell is our president and CEO at XBRL US, and Campbell was intimately involved in developing the FERC taxonomies. He also helped develop the taxonomies that are used today by SEC filers reporting to the SEC. And so with that, I'm going to go straight into XBRL fundamentals. So XBRL, Extensible Business Reporting Language, is an open, non-proprietary data standard. That means that there are no licensing fees associated with the use of the standard. XBRL is maintained by a global nonprofit standards organization called XBRL International. XBRL International is responsible for maintaining and expanding upon the specification. And they have country-specific jurisdictions around the world in about, I believe, about 26 different countries. Here at XBRL US, we are the US jurisdiction of XBRL International, and we are the national standard setter here. Our role is to do development work and to focus on adoption efforts for the XBRL standard where we think that they're going to be useful. One thing I think is important to note is that XBRL is a data standard. It is not a technical format like XML or JSON or CSV or HTML, and it's also not a product like Excel. So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion as to what XBRL actually is. And as we get a little bit further on, I think we'll help you understand that a bit more. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Campbell, who is going to talk to you about how XBRL gives meaning to data.
Thank you, Michelle. So today we're just going to look at how XBRL's been implemented at FERC and how it's been structured in terms of a model, in terms of capturing all the information that you traditionally reported in a form. And so what the XBRL standard does, and what you've probably seen with some of the documentation that's been published by the FERC, particularly the taxonomy, which many of you may have seen in Yeti, and that's what's called a taxonomy, and that's really like the basis for a blank form. It really defines all the data that needs to be reported and what's the format of that data and what should it include. But it also includes things like calculation checks and validation rules, which allow really put constraints and really help to define what is the data that's meant to be reported. So in the taxonomy itself, we've got an example here. You can see there's a balance sheet. And so every single fact or piece of information that's reported as part of the filing will have information associated with it. So in this case, we've got cash, but there's also other information associated with it. What's the, what type of item is? It's a monetary item. You can see there's a definition there. But then the facts themselves also have information associated with them, which entities belong to, what's the unit of measure, what period does it apply to. And we'll talk about this quite a lot. When you see the filings based on how you used to do them, a lot of the ways of explaining the data was based on what they call a GPS location, like a row and column identifier. Whereas in XBRL, the identifiers are really what's the XBRL element, what's the period, which is kind of in this case would align to a column. And then units as well are also included, which is pretty blanket in general, but also there can be specific units that need to be applied in certain circumstances, like the inch of a pipe, the width of a pipeline, or the length in miles of a pipeline. We're going to go to the next slide, please, Michelle. So we talk about the taxonomy, and this is just a snapshot of the taxonomy from Yeti, which many of you have seen. That taxonomy is currently available on the FERC, so you can go and look at that on the FERC website. I mean, I think, and you can put comments on it as well. But basically, what the taxonomy, it mirrors the information that's required to be reported on the form, and it's basically tries to represent all the different types of information that wants to be collected by the FERC. And the advantage of doing this over doing like a GPS location is if they need to make changes to the form, the data should stay constant through time. Whereas if they added a new row on a form, then the reference for a data element would change just because of its physical location. Whereas the point of an XBRL taxonomy is that the description of the data should stay constant because it's kind of closely associated with what the data means rather than its location on a form. And that has a lot of advantages for being able to use the data, but also for being able to prepare the data. You don't have to worry about tracking where the data goes. So if you know what it is, then in theory, you could generate the form automatically out of systems if they have that mapping to the taxonomy in it. I'm going to go to the next slide, please, Michelle. And here we just picked up an example where we've got an element in the taxonomy. We've got accounts receivable. And then there's some information on the right. All this information is included in the taxonomy. And if you're familiar with Yeti, I can kind of give you a high level of what this means. But on the top, there's labels. Every element can have multiple labels associated with it. And there are a lot of elements that are used throughout the form, which could appear in multiple locations, but the label on it may be different depending on where it appears. So at the top, you can see there's one label. In many cases, there'll be more than one label. There'll be standard label with the label of what it'll appear when it's in a balance sheet. And there may be different labels depending if it's on a subschedule. It may be called something slightly different. It also includes the documentation describing what the element is. And then the second part is references. And most of the references that have been created in the forms basically provide a link back to where the data was reported in the original form. So you can see here the accounts receivable, the current value was reported on row 6, column C of the comparative balance sheet, and the prior year's value was reported on column D, row 6. So that mapping back to the prior forms is available in the taxonomy. So in theory, you can do basically a crosswalk between the form and what elements should be used in the taxonomy. And we're publishing some documentation that'll make that significantly easier. So you can look up the form location and it'll tell you what the element and what period you should tag it with. And at the bottom is the properties of the element. This kind of tells you, is it a debit, is it a credit, is it measured at a point in time, which is a period type of an instant. And then there's a few other things in here, like what's its name, its accounts receivable, that's the element name. The namespace, you probably don't really need to worry about too much. The data type's just telling you got to put a monetary item type. And this may be relevant when you're doing, that's kind of only relevant when you've got some different items. If they give you a percentage, it kind of gives you a clue as to what type of information should be put in there. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please, Michelle. And this is what I was talking about, was the schedule mapping. So we'll be publishing this, but this will just, and this is a form 1, not a form 6. But if you look at this, you can see I reported a value in row 3, column C, and it tells you I should be using construction work in progress, and I should be using the current period for it. So this mapping will be available, and this mapping will be available for every single schedule in the taxonomy in the form. So you should be able to go through and look up a form, look up the row column, and it'll tell you exactly what element you should use. So it should make it very easy in terms of how to reconcile between what you had with your prior form filing and what it's going to look like in XBRL. Go to the next slide, please. So basically, the taxonomy allows allows to represent a lot of different data types. And as some of you are aware, there's, you can put disclosures from maybe some of you copy your SEC disclosures and you put them in the form that can be put into the, they're defined in the taxonomy, so you can put large blocks of text. You can do monetary items, integer, measures of volume, all the kind of stuff that's going to be in the form. In the traditional form is represented in the taxonomy. It also contains some things like the presentation hierarchy, which just define the order of where things appear, and that when the forms are rendered, that's used to control, to some extent, the way that things are presented. There's also calculations included in the taxonomy, and they can be used to check that calculations are operating correctly. There's also the definition link base. This really is used primarily in the FERC filings to, you don't have to change any of this, but this will basically, in software that you're using, it'll tell you, oh, you've entered a value that has an incorrect dimension. You can't put a dimension on a particular line item. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. As I mentioned, it's got the references and the labels in there as well. In the next slide. In terms of just the difference between the taxonomy and the XBRL instance document, the taxonomy is defined by the FERC. That's all that's there and that's available, and that could be, there'll be another update of that coming in April, just to address any issues that have been raised as people are playing with the taxonomy and software providers are implementing software to use it, and as we're going through and reviewing additional comments. So there will be some changes made to the taxonomy, relatively minor. A lot of them are like fixing references, and sometimes there's some typos in some of the documentation. So a lot of that, the kind of little things getting cleaned up. So that's the taxonomy. But in addition, there is the XBRL instance document, and this is just really the data that is in compliance with the taxonomy, and that's what the filers have to prepare. And what is actually prepared is just an XML document. For those of you who are familiar with SEC filings, there's no extension taxonomy that you have to create. There's no extension presentation, calculation, labels, any of that stuff. There's just one document that needs to be submitted, and that's basically just with the elements and the values. So this should make this significantly easier. There's no requirement to create extensions as part of this file, as part of the FERC filing, so you're not going to have to do any of that. In some cases, there is additional information that you need to provide, and all of that information will be provided either through something called a type dimension or through footnotes. So you can, the same way that you used to attach footnotes, that still can be done. I think in this example, there's a little blue thing on it. It's rendered. The footnotes will appear at the bottom, but we'll look at those in a minute. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please, Michelle. We have some.
I think we're actually going to go to CPE questions now, Campbell.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to bring up our first poll question. So hopefully everyone should be able to see this right now. So the first question is, an XBRL instance document, also called an XBRL report, can be best characterized by which of the following statements? And just click on the button for the one that you think is the most appropriate response. Is it represents the facts reported in a financial statement, for example, BP Pipelines Form 6 for 2019? Or number 2, represents a digital dictionary of concepts that need to be reported? Or is it number 3, represents the hierarchical structure and relationships between items needed to be reported in a financial statement? So this is an XBRL instance document. So we're going to give this about 20 seconds more. And then we'll be going on to our second question. And just so you know, the correct answer for that is that an XBRL instance document can be best characterized by representing the facts reported in a financial statement, like BP's BP Pipelines Form 6 for 2019. Okay, so let me go to the next poll question. Okay, so which of the following may be associated with a core concept in an XBRL taxonomy? Is it response number 1, data type, for example, monetary, string, text block, percent? or number 2, reporting entity names, or number 3, period, for example, 2018, 2019, or 2020, which would be associated with a core concept in an XBRL taxonomy. So about another 20 seconds or so. Okay, we're going to close down polling here in just a minute, just a couple seconds. And just so you know that the answer to that, what's in an XBRL taxonomy related to a concept would be a data type. A data type is in the taxonomy. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling, and I'm going to turn it back over to Campbell to continue our presentation.
All right, thanks, Michelle. So just for the next section, we're just going to go through some of the items to be aware of in tagging. And this is probably going to be relevant no matter what software you're using, but it's some things that you should be aware of when you're actually doing the filing. So this way you can control how your filing looks and how it renders. And then also some of the issues you may run into, and you'll probably wonder, what should I do in those cases? So we're trying to predict what those will be. And so then if you run up against them, you kind of know what to do. So we're going to just go through some of these things you can see here: type dimensions, how to sort things, what do I do when I've got duplicate values and they differ, how do I identify periods and text block items, what do I do with validation, rendering, and footnotes. So we'll go to the first part. We'll just start with type dimensions. Maybe the next slide, please. Right, so we've used some type dimensions, but what a type dimension is it really these are used significantly right throughout the FERC taxonomy, and it's used in any schedule where you have a list of rows and you had the flexibility to add items in rows. So for example, it might be the listing of directors. So you can just keep adding director, anything where it's kind of like a sequence where you can just keep adding items to it. And that's where type dimension is going to be used. And you'll see those in the taxonomy. They're going to be used on those schedules where you've got a lot of flexibility in the terms of the things that you add. And it's really dependent on the content that you have, or the number of items you may have in a given list. And on the sequences, there's no limit on how many you can provide. You can go to infinity if you wanted to, but and this may be a slight change from what you had in the past. Sometimes you would add another schedule and another schedule and another schedule, a supplemental schedule. So you kind of don't have this idea of supplemental schedules. They just keep getting added and added and added. So this is kind of where the type dimension is used, and the impact is on these schedules where you have these sequences. There are some other cases where you kind of have these mini sequences, and this may be like in some of the financial statements, like in the cash flow or the retained earnings, where the old forms had some blank rows and you'd add them in, and in many cases there wouldn't be enough space, so there wouldn't be enough rows, so then you'd add the extra rows into the as a footnote. Now you don't have to do that anymore. You can just keep adding item. You can use the type dimension in these cases. What happens is you basically add the row and add it. Most software will probably allow you to add another row and another row and another row, and you can just keep adding items into the form. And in the form, you may have had them on row 5. And when you render these, you'll see this. And if you look at some of the example filings, it might be 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. So you can keep adding items. So for example, on the cash flow statement, we add back adjustments rather than putting a total and then putting all the adjustments in the footnote. Now you can just put them on the main body of the form. So that's another probably one of the more major significant changes that you'll see in the forms. And they're just giving you that flexibility to be able to add as many rows as you want. And that's being done with type dimensions. The other thing to be aware of with type dimensions is that there's an identifier which basically identifies the row. You don't see it in the filing, but it's in the underlying data, which basically says, if it's a director, you assign a key or an identifier for that row. So, and these keys are used to pretty much allow you to basically, anyone using the data, be able to get comparability over time. So one of the things you want to make sure you do is that you keep these identifiers consistent from one filing to the next. So for example, if you've got a listing of directors and you put the identifier for that row in, you kind of want, and if it's John Smith, you kind of want to make sure that the identifier for John Smith stays the same from one filing to the next. And this means when all the data is accumulated, people do, cross period analysis, they're going to make sure that they're comparing apples to apples. So the FERC has this in one of their filing guides. They expect that if you're talking about the same thing, if you're talking about the same property, if you're talking about the same pipeline, you should be using the same member to identify that same pipeline from one filing to the next. So that's just one of the things you want to talk to any software vendor you're going to use. How can I ensure these are the same? Most software will probably say, oh, I'm going to be able to roll forward the prior year to the next year and roll everything forward. So it may not be an issue to keep them consistent. But if they don't do that, you may want to ask them about how can I do that? Because you don't really want to have to manage that manually. The other thing is these sequences. A lot of the sequences or these items will have totals at the bottom. And so when you have the total, basically you're not going to have the type dimension or the sequence on it. The type dimension basically is a disaggregation of the total. So let's say you had a number of these items that added up to a total. Basically that last item on the form is not going to have the type dimension on it. So that's some of the things to be aware of just with the type dimensions. Predominantly, they need to be consistent over time, and some of the forms are going to change because you're going to see some of these where you had blank rows before where you could add them on, things like financial statements. Can you go to the next slide, please, Michelle? And here's an example of these items. You can see here we've got these directors, and you're going to basically be able to add as many directors as you like. There are a couple of changes you will notice to some of the forms. In this kind, you see the chairman of the executive committee and the member of the executive committee. There's basically check boxes that you can basically now indicate, or flags where you can indicate the position, whereas these would have been included as text potentially in the title in the past. So in some cases, some of this data has been disaggregated just to make it clearer and get consistency from one filer to the next. Go to the next slide, please, Michelle. And so this kind of example, just working through one of these examples with the directors, you can see here we have a director axis, and on that director axis, you've got different line items, and the line items in the taxonomy are the name and title, the office, chairman, executive committee. Those line items appear as basically column headings. And the member on this, you could have a member 2, and the next one you could have a member 3. I would recommend against using a member 2 and a member 3 because it kind of, unless you can kind of remember, you keep them consistent through time, you probably may want to have a member called D Rush and another member called S Bauer, or some other identifier that just so that kind of is unique to the actual item that you're talking about. So as a pipeline, you might want to make the member the name of the pipeline. The member name can be anything you like. It just can't have lots of spaces on it. So the taxonomy allows you to put these members on, which basically can be an alphanumeric string. So you've got a lot of flexibility on what you can use as the member name. You go to the next item. So let's talk about sorting for a minute. Now, in many cases, you're going to want to be able to control the order of which these things appear on the schedule when it's rendered. The FERC doesn't necessarily care about this, but the filers will care, and because when you render it, you kind of want it to look readable. So there is the ability to control the order of the items, and so every time you define a row, you get the option to put the order number on it. And so what will happen is when this is rendered, it's going to render it based on what you define the order numbers as. You define the order number as. The order number is not the same as the line number. They're completely independent of each other. Just a few things just to be aware of. Those order numbers, they're going to be a decimal. So you could just have an integer if you wanted, but you can make a decimal. And that reason for that is that it allows you to insert items over time. The order number doesn't have to be consistent from one filing to the next. You can have any order number you like. And the order number must always be on a dimension, right? You can't have an order number not on a dimension. It's always going to be on a dimension. As part of the rollout, and you'll see this on the FERC website, you could go back and you can download some of your filings where historical filings have been converted into XBRL. A lot of those have had order numbers have been automatically put on, and those order numbers are based on the order that they appeared in the original filing. And in the Visual Fox Pro, you'll see the order numbers basically just picking up the row numbers that were in the original filings that were made in the Visual Fox Pro database. In some cases, there are some schedules which have multiple dimensions, and then in some cases, the order number needs to be put on both dimensions, and in other cases, it only needs to be put on one. We're preparing some documentation for those schedules, which document exactly which dimensions the order number should be put on. If you put it on the wrong dimension, then the order might get all screwed up. So we're going to be providing some documentation on what is the order number on which schedule the order number should be on, but this only affects a couple of schedules. But if you have a question about that, if there's only one dimension on a schedule, then it's pretty straightforward. That's what the order number goes on. In some rare cases, there are some schedules which have two type dimensions. So there just needs to be a decision there. You just need to know which one to put it on in those cases. Okay, next slide, please. Duplicate values. Now, when you've got the same number in multiple places, sometimes the subtotal of one schedule will correspond to an item on another schedule. So what happens is when we have these situations, in most cases, the value is tagged exactly the same way. So if you tag the value once, it's going to appear in both locations. And some cases, when we developed the taxonomy, we realized that they had the elements which we thought they should be the same, but in some cases they were actually different. In some cases, there may be different element used, so you may have to tag them in both locations. But generally, where you've got a schedule and it ties back to a face financial, you should only have to enter the value once. In some cases, there are companies where the values are different. They've got some adjustment and they couldn't capture it on the schedule for whatever reason. In those cases, you should enter the value that's on the primary financial statement, and then the value that will automatically appear on the schedule. And then you should just put a footnote on the fact to indicate what the reason for the differences are. The reason for the difference. In addition, there will be, if you try to put duplicate values in, if you try to put the value into the instance twice, you'll get a validation error saying, hey, you've entered the element with two different values. You can't do that. So that a validation error will come up for that. So you won't be able to file with duplicate values anyway. Okay. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Michelle. In terms of monetary amounts on the filings, obviously they're all in US dollars. There are some schedules where you can use units to report values. The units that you use are typically defined on the schedule, so you can see their miles, inches, etc. You have to put in the XBRL instance what is the unit of measure on those amounts. It's just not a matter of putting that amount in. You still have to put a unit on them. So you'll still in those values, if you reported the number 5 there, you can see on the bottom row 4, column F, value of 5. When you enter that value as an XBRL, you'd still have to say this is the number 5, whereas most numbers you'd be putting a unit of US dollars. On this one, you're going to have to put a unit of miles. And most of the software should do that automatically for you, I'd hope. But we have put for anything that's not a US dollar, we've put what is the unit you need to enter in the label for those items. So if you look at the taxonomy, you'll see something called unit of measure, and it'll tell you what the unit of measure is that you expect to be used with a given concept. The other thing is there is the accuracy of the numbers. If some software gives you the option to choose the accuracy, If you get that choice in the software that you're using, if they don't default, they should basically, the accuracy of all of this should be default to 0. This means every number is pretty much accurate to the dollar. So the FERC expects that. You can't say this number is accurate to 1 million. It's got to be accurate to 0. So pretty much in all cases, the accuracy is going to be 0. Okay, if we go to the next slide, please. So let's look at the periods. So all the values that are reported have to have a period associated with them. The period itself is based on the report year and the report period that you enter into the instance. So what that means is that whenever you put that report year and the report period in, the way that the values are rendered on a form is going to be based on that. So this makes it, if you change that report year and that report period, then render the form, you can basically, the form re-renders. If you move them forward 1 year, all the values that were in the current year will then move to the prior, and everything that's in the prior won't appear anymore. However, there are some validation rules in here which stop you from reporting values for, periods you can't, would not typically be included in the form. So if you try and report for periods which didn't exist on the form, like 3 years prior, you're going to get a validation error for those. Across most of the form, there's various periods that can be used. So obviously, everything finishes on a fiscal year. So basically, you're going to be using, if it's a quarterly, you've got to use the quarters that the FERC defines. And if you're using years, you've got to use the years that they define. So you may, if you use the incorrect period, so let's say, you use, rather than 31st of December, use the 30th of December, what you're going to find is none of those values will be rendered because it's an invalid period. And in fact, you get a validation error saying, hey, we don't, this is not a period that we'd expect to be reported. So the periods are pretty fixed. You kind of have to, but you just, as you're entering those values are entered, you're just going to make sure that the periods on them are correct. So that's just something to be aware of. And things like the balance sheet, and sorry, in the cash flow statement, for example, if you're doing a quarterly filing, the opening and the closing balance won't match because obviously it's the period from the closing quarter. It's not going to obviously equal the opening value of your current quarter. So you're probably aware of that with the forms already, but there are some validation. Typically what will happen is if you're doing like a yearly cash flow, the opening balance, you enter the ending balance, the opening balance will automatically appear because it's the same element. But if you're doing a quarterly filing, that's not going to happen because it's the end of the prior quarter. And then in terms of roll forwards, there's validation rules to check that roll forwards work correctly as well. So you just need to make sure that you get the correct periods on any roll forward items you may have. Yeah, it's an opening balance plus any changes equals the ending balance. Let's talk about text block items for a minute. There is on the Form 6 the requirement to report things like changes during the year or financial statement information. Any of this should be reported as a text block item. This is similar to what the same way the SEC does it. So basically, you can submit HTML data into the XML. However, it's going to be valid what's called XHTML, and the main difference is that all the tags have to match and they have to close. So when you copy these in, you may want to render them and have a look at them, just make sure they look reasonable. Any of the formatting that you should have should follow through in the same way that you've formatted it in the past. If you're copying data from an SEC filing and putting it in there, you cannot put in the inline XBRL that you had reported to the SEC. So what you can do is you can just go, if you could take your SEC filing, you could take the XML version, which the SEC very kindly produces. You could copy that and then you could paste that into your FERC filing if you wanted. And the reason for that is because when these forms are rendered for the FERC, they render them as an inline filing. So then you kind of have a Russian doll situation where you have the inline and an inline. It doesn't make any sense. So just to make sure that it's just one thing to be aware of. If you're copying some of this, this XHTML. You want to copy the XHTML, which has had the inline XBRL from the SEC pulled out if you're going to use the SEC stuff. If you're not doing inline for the SEC, then just the regular HTML you would have filed would be fine. Okay. The next slide, please. So we'll just talk about validations. Michelle, we don't have any questions at this point, do we?
Sorry, I had to get off mute. We don't have any questions right now. If you do have questions for any member of the audience, please remember to click on the Q&A link, and we'll take questions as they come in.
Okay. So validations. Validation rules apply to the entire form. So there's one set of validation rules for the Form 6, and they apply to the Form 6 and the Form 6Q. Obviously, if you have a schedule in the quarterly filing, which is not required to be filed, then those validations are not going to run. And the validations are pretty simple. They generally do a few things. They check that the totals add across and the cross add. So basically you make sure that any schedule you've got where you've got a total at the bottom, or if you've got a balance sheet, cash flow, and there's the traditional calculations that have been on the form are included in the validations. Also checks that the periods are valid, the units are valid, and also check that the required elements that you're supposed to that have to be submitted, like the report date and the report year, are included, and the validations are described in the instructions. And we're going to be putting out documentation as well that you can look at, which basically describes what the validations are in more detail as well. The validation rules themselves are published by the FERC, and they can be processed using software from a REL, and this is very similar to what the SEC does. So you can run these validations before you file, or the software that you're using can have that baked in, so that can run it as well and check that the data is valid before you actually file it with the FERC. And the validation rules, over time they could change, but generally they'll change in the same basically time the taxonomy is going to be changed. If there's a new taxonomy released, then the validation rules will probably be updated as well. But most of all the software should be able to handle that. So no matter what, you should be always running the validation rules that are associated with a given taxonomy. Okay. So in terms of rendering the data, the FERC has published also an add-in, what's called a plugin, but an addition to the open source software called a REL, which allows you to basically take your XML filing which you prepared, and it will basically render it as an inline XBRL document. This does not have to be filed for FERC. They are actually, when you file the XML file, they'll actually render it. And if you do a test filing, they can do a rendering of it. So then you can look at what your filing looks like. And we've taken that same source code as well, and we've put it online. So if you go to the XBRL US website, you can have a look at that, and I can show you how it works if we've got time. I think we have time. And then that allows you to be able to render your form. And this is really useful for kind of review. You want to make sure, hey, I've got all the right values. Are they in the right places? If it's in the wrong place, then you probably tagged it incorrectly. So Michelle, I'll just share my screen for a second. I'll just show you how this works. You could stop sharing.
Sure. And Campbell, as you're doing that, we did get a question, so I'll just raise this question while you're pulling that up. Some of us are first-time users of XBRL. Can we see more examples of how XBRL works and the tagging itself? I don't know if that's something that you want to try to get into now, or if we have
some time at the end, I can
do a separate webinar.
Yeah, and I can show briefly at the end of the webinar just what that looks like. And so people kind of get a feel for it. It'll be a little bit more technical, but we can definitely do that. This is the rendering. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to choose a file. I've already chose one. Let's say I've got American Partners LLC. I can then select, this is going to the XBRL US website. We have this on our website. You can go to filers, and we've got a link here for FERC reporting, and you can go and then you can run the validation rules from here as well, or you can do rendering of a filing. So I'm just going to pick this American Panther LLC. I can pick what form I want. We've got all the forms here, but obviously for the people on this call, Form 6 is the only relevant one. And that's how I want to do the balance sheet, and then I can submit this. And what this is doing is then it's just going off, and then it's rendering. It just takes that form. It just takes that specific schedule, and then it renders it. So here it comes. But you can render the entire thing. You can render the whole thing or a specific schedule if you want to. It's kind of really convenient just to be able to render a single schedule at a time, because you may you may fill it out, and then you just want to say, okay, I just want to see what it looks like, that particular schedule, rather than rendering the whole thing, which is going to take more time. I just click on this, and this just shows what the rendered forms looks like for this particular company. So then you can just check, okay, does this match up with what I expected it to look like? This is just basically an inline XBRL filing. So I don't have an example of the Form 6, but I have an example of this is like a Form 1, for example. When it renders it, you can actually open, we've put some of these in the SEC viewer so you can see what's there, but you can then see this is a balance sheet. This is similar, but you can see, okay, I can see what element it used, what was the value, what was the period, what was the unit of measure, it's USD. These are kind of some of the things that we were talking about. So each of these, when this is rendered, it's rendered as an inline XBRL document. And I'm just looking at this particular one using the SEC viewer. It should all be intercompatible because it's a standard. So then you can go and, and I'm sure software vendors will do this. They may want to say, look, you can look at it in the SEC viewer, so you can find things faster. You can use this if you wanted to, review your filing. You can see everything with assets in it or whatever. So it just means that now that the data is all in a structured format, you can actually take advantage of the tools that are available. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go back to the presentation.
Okay, and Campbell, we have another question. Yep. Will the filers get account ID to access the XBRL website for filing and submission? Is the local application that we are using now no longer valid? And I think this really gets into how to actually prepare your filing. So do you want to try to address that?
I think we're not seeing the slides, Michelle. We're seeing the your view.
Not, okay.
Screen. Okay, so I think this question about the local application that we're now using is no longer. I assume you're referring to the VisualFox Pro application. So the FERC is going to obviously phase out the VisualFox Pro application, and that's obviously going to happen next year. And I think the first XBRL filings are expected to be starting after November. I can't remember the exact day, but in November, then you would start filing, be able to start filing under the new XBRL method. The FERC is not going to provide an application to be able to do that. However, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, there are a number of software vendors who are going to provide support for it. And companies, if they wanted to, they could prepare, if they know how to do this, they could have their IT group, and I know some larger filers are doing this, they could have their IT group just basically create the XML file, which is going to be submitted to the FERC automatically out of their backend system. So that's kind of another option as well. And the reason, obviously, for doing this whole thing is to make it, if you wanted to, you could, in theory, make a lot of, if you have this information already in databases internally, you might be able to generate the form completely automatically with no manual entry. Now, that may not be feasible given, obviously, the nature of some of the disclosures, but a lot of it, in theory, should be able to be automated. The account ID, if just on that part of the question, you can actually, if you already have an account ID with the FERC, you can log into the FERC website, you can see your prior filings, and I'll show that at the end if we've got time. And then you can download your prior filings and you can see what they look like in an XBRL format. And that'll kind of give you a good idea of, what the expectation is. Yeah, what's the time now? Yeah, we probably have time to have a look at that at the end. Okay, so just one other area to be aware of is footnotes. So in prior forms, people use footnotes a lot. Companies use footnotes a lot to report data because it doesn't really fit into the form cleanly. There's additional disclosures that have been asked for by the FERC, and the forms didn't really cover that. In general, with the XBRL move to XBRL, the requirements that were in the form have basically been locked in place. It's just, there is requests for additional information in the forms, and people would report that in the footnotes in the past. Generally, the forms have stayed the same. The FERC's not tried to change those or add additional columns or additional fields for information that has traditionally been reported in the footnotes. There are some exceptions to that, obviously, in some circumstances where footnote data was provided because the schedules, it just wasn't technically feasible to do it. But if there is additional disclosure items that were required, generally those will still be required to be put into footnotes. So there is a footnote capability in XBRL as well, so you can attach a footnote to any fact. And so basically it just links, it's basically a link. You basically put the textual disclosure or whatever footnote information you want in the XBRL filing. And then you give that an identifier, and then there's a way to link from that ID back to the fact. Now, most software should probably handle this for you, so you wouldn't have to deal with the nitty gritty of it. But under the hood, it basically is a pointer that points to the fact and then points to the actual text in a footnote. So you can put XHTML into the footnotes. You can make these footnotes as long as you like. And so you can put as many footnotes as you want on a form, and a fact can have one or many footnotes associated with it. So you don't have to have one, you could have 2, 3, you could have 20 if you wanted. So it's quite flexible in terms of having the footnotes on there. The one other requirement that was added here was the ability for confidential data. Apparently the Visual Fox Pro program had an option to be able to do that. You request that data was confidential. I don't think anyone's ever done it, but if you wanted to, that is an option there, and that's supported in XBRL as well. And that's also done with a footnote where you just basically indicate that the fact is confidential, and then when the FERC receive your filing, that gets flagged, and then they basically assess whether it should be treated as confidential or not, and then they will let you as the filer know. And if it is, when the data is rendered, it'll just be it'll be basically blocked out so people can't see that information. But to indicate that you want a fact to be confidential, that's also supported with footnotes as well. Go to the next slide, Michelle. Working with XBRL US, you're going to start on this. There's one question, maybe I should answer that, and then you can go through this. Someone had asked, is there a FERC beta test site to test the XBRL file? Yep, you can get if you go to I'll show you that in a minute, but there's a FERC eCollections website. Let me just show you where that is now, and then Michelle, you can go through working with vendors, if that's okay. Can I share my screen?
Mm-hmm.
So FERC has if you go to eCollection, ferc.gov, and then on this site, you can log in as a filer. And you get a CID number. You can log in, and it'll show you your filings, and then basically also give you the ability to do test submissions as well. So
yeah, we're not seeing your site.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. Let me just bring that up. Okay, is it sharing?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's not letting me sign in. I had requested a item for this. Let me just see if I can get in. Okay. just going to sign in, and you can see, you'll see here on this, these are all, this gives example filings, and you can see, let's just look at these. And so, for example, here's a Form 6 BP midstream. If we just click on it, not to click on, then you can, on the site, it gives you the option to download the XBRL file and the HTML file. And then it also gives you, as a filer, it gives you the option to log in as a filer and do a test submission and do a validation and validate your filing and everything else you want to do. I just don't have a log on for that. But this is where you go, ecollection.ferc.gov. And it basically will give you all that information. But if you want to, as we mentioned before, look at a filing, you can go here, you can look at it, you can look at the XBRL file, you can look at the HTML file, you can download it. This is Monarch Oil Pipeline, and I can then look at this filing, for example. This is just to cover the other person's question, what it looks like. This is Monarch Oil Pipeline. And you can see here's the unit information is in here, and then this is all the period information. And then in here is, and this is what it looks like. Someone asked, and I'm sorry to put you through this, but so then you can see here the gathering revenues. This is what each individual fact looks like in the XBRL filing. So you've got the gathering revenues, trunk revenues, operating revenues, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll hand it back to you, Michelle, and then you can go through the software vendors.
Great, okay. So let me go ahead and share my screen again. Okay, so thanks, Campbell. Hopefully that was helpful for everybody to get a good sense for all the things that you'll need to be aware of. And I think going forward, we'll probably be planning, around the first of the year, some additional webinars to get into more detailed instructions as on the actual tagging process. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that there are a number of vendors out there that can help you with the filing. And the companies you see listed on the screen here are ones that we know very well. We've worked with them for many years, most of them, and and they help companies prepare their XBRL filings for the SEC, for even sometimes for for other initiatives in other countries. So the companies that we want to mention are Advanced Computer Innovations, DataTrax, Donnelly Financial Solutions, Iris Business Services, NovaWorks, P3 Data Systems, RDG Filings, Systrends, and Workiva. And so these are all organizations that are members of XBRL US, and they have offerings that can help you. And as you start thinking about vendors that you want to work with, there are certain questions that you need to ask. Make sure that, and there are others beyond the ones that I mentioned here, but make sure that you ask, does your application support FERC validation? That's very important because those are the business rules that you want to make sure that you run those rules against your filing to ensure that there are no errors in the filing. Make sure that the application that you use accommodates type dimensions. Because as Campbell explained, type dimensions are a really key feature of the FERC taxonomy, and you need to make sure that the application that you're working with, can manage type dimensions. Find out what experience the organization has preparing XBRL for other entities, because that kind of experience can really help smooth the way, and they'll be able to answer a lot of your questions very easily. Find out how long it will take them to prepare your filing. Find out if you're able to review the XBRL tags used on each fact that's reported. Oftentimes, there may be multiple parties within your organization that need to review, a financial document before it's finally submitted to the commission, and find out what's the process to do that. Is there a way that multiple parties can look at, review, and approve the document before it's finalized? Oftentimes, you'll find, as I'm sure you found in your traditional process, is that you may need to change a value in a report, maybe at the last minute. So, check with the vendor and find out, when is it pencils down? When do you have to, if there's a last minute change, will they be able to accommodate that change? Also, speak with the prospective vendor about how the process might differ the second time around. What we've often found in any kind of XBRL implementation is that the first time that you go through the process, it can be kind of time consuming, you're getting up a learning curve, there's a lot to think about. But the second time around, the third time around, the fourth time around, it'll get easier and easier. So check with your vendor about that and how they can smooth that process. Also find out if the vendor can give you a printout of the FERC rendering of your filing, because that could be really helpful in terms of doing that, that review. So these are just a few questions that you should ask. And as I mentioned, going forward, we will have additional webinars. And we're probably going to bring some of these vendors into the webinars to show you what they can do and how to actually tag using some of these tools. And each tool may differ, but they're all going to be doing the same thing. So it'll give you a sense for how the process will really work.
So just before you go to the CPE
Sure.
questions, Michelle, there was just one question. Will the slides be available? And I believe they will be, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we will be archiving the entire replay of the program, and then of course making the slides available as well. And we also have a page on our website that I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes that Campbell touched on briefly when he did a demonstration, that has a lot of content for FERC filers that we prepared. And we're actually continually adding to that content over time. So, we'll send that link out to you, encourage you to visit it and come back again, because there'll be more content added there over time. But so for now, let's go into the final poll questions. And I'm going to launch the polling right now. And so again, just click on the button that you think is most appropriate. And the question is, which statement best describes the FERC taxonomy? Is it an open taxonomy, which means that FERC filers can create custom reported items that are not in the current FERC taxonomy? Is it a closed taxonomy, which means that FERC filers are limited to using only the concepts provided in the FERC taxonomy? Or is it a hybrid taxonomy, which means that FERC allows some custom extensions to be created? So we'll take about another 30 seconds to get the answers to those questions. Okay, and we did get another question that I'll answer as we're waiting to finish the poll. The question is, are the vendors service providers for XBRL, or do they have software to generate the XBRL file? They are software providers, and that you as a filer can use to generate your own XBRL file. So some of them are service providers, and they will do the whole process for you. And some of them have applications or tools that you can use to generate the file yourself. So it's really both. Answers to they're really both.
Just to be aware on this is you have many options. You could get someone, just give it to someone and someone can do it. You just provide them with the data. You get software and do it yourself, or you could even, some people just want, maybe there's even software you can use where you can just get it and basically prepare it yourself and prepare the whole thing and like an Excel spreadsheet or whatever. So it's not like there's one way to file. You have many options here. So really it's just working out what option's best for you.
That's right. Okay, I just closed down that poll, and just so you know, the answer to that is the FERC taxonomy is a closed taxonomy. So the FERC does not allow for the creation of custom extensions, which is something that we see in the SEC world. And so I think it makes it a little bit easier to work with the FERC taxonomy to some extent. So let's go to our last poll question. Which statement best represents the definition of the XBRL standard? It is a technical format like XML, JSON, or CSV? That's response number one. It is an open, non-proprietary standard that renders financial and other types of data into machine-readable format. Or is it number three, it is a product like Excel or a software application that makes data computer readable? Which statement best represents the definition of the XBRL standard? Okay, just about another 30 seconds here. Okay, just another 10 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close down the poll, and just so you know, the answer to that question is XBRL is an open, non-proprietary standard that renders financial and other types of data into machine-readable format. So I'm closing the polling on that. Thank you for responding to that. And we'll move along. This is the slide that I want to show you all. This is a website that we created specifically for FERC filers. And as you can see, we have tools and instructions. We have ways you can run some of these applications locally. We will be posting a database of FERC filings so that you can analyze your own data as well as peer data. And then we'll continuously add educational resources here as well. Our goal is to make this program very successful because that's really what we're all about is implementing standards successfully. And so, we really have a vested interest in making sure that you are all very successful. So please come to this page. We'll be emailing this out to you sometime in the next couple of days. And there's just last, I want to mention some additional events that we have coming up for public utilities. We have some additional instructional webinars for FERC filers. We have centralized service companies that's going to take place tomorrow. On December 10th, we have one for electric transmitting utilities. And then we also have a couple of webinars that might be of interest to you just as public companies. On December 3rd, which is Thursday this week, we have a webinar on our data quality rule sets. And this is for SEC reporting that might be of interest to you. And then on December 15th, we have a webinar on automating sustainability data using XBRL. And this gets into ESG type data and an XBRL taxonomy that's been developed for that. So I want to thank everybody for coming today, and thanks to Campbell Pride for his presentation. And we hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.